Hello there and good afternoon. My name is Brian Kane, publisher of Xconomy. As I hope you know, Xconomy focuses on the engaging of life science leaders and innovators at the intersection of science and technology. Our mission via our newsletters, our events, and our award programs is to connect the funding, the partnerships, technologies, and science, all necessary to support and enhance the successful development of novel therapeutics. I'm happy to welcome you and over 250 of your colleagues to today's presentation, The Need for Manufacturing Execution Systems in Cell and Gene Therapy. It's brought to you by Xconomy and is presented by Global OT/IT Quality Services. In the digital manufacturing world, processes and data that support all levels of the business must interact using compatible data models. Today's presentation will provide an understanding of why manufacturing execution systems should be considered early in the development of cell and gene therapy products. Now, typically, this type of information system is deployed with commercial products, but the demand of early phase and clinical manufacturing can also take advantage of MES. So today we'll review the business drivers and technical considerations that need to be made. We'll focus on the special requirements of cell and gene product manufacturing, and we'll also discuss how MES fits into a digital strategy. So before we begin, let me explain how you can participate in today's presentation. First of all, if you have any technical difficulties during today's session, please press the help button on your player console to receive assistance in solving common issues. We certainly welcome your questions during today's event. So in order to submit your questions to today's presenter, simply type your question into the question window on the left-hand side of your screen and then hit the submit button. We'll be answering as many of those questions as possible during the Q&A session that will follow the main presentation, but please feel free to send in your questions at any time and we'll add them into the queue. If at any time you're having audio difficulties or advancing, simply hit your F5 button to refresh your webcast console. And also, please be aware that today's sessions are being recorded and will be available on the Xconomy website, xconomy.com, beginning tomorrow for your review. You'll be notified by email when the archive is available. Okay, let me please introduce today's presenter. Bob Lechich is the Principal Manufacturing and Supply Chain Consultant with Global OT/IT Quality Services. Bob, the floor is all yours.
All right, well, thank you very much. And good afternoon, good evening. I'm sure some folks are outside our Eastern time zone here, so thank you for joining us. I was asked to present on this topic. I think it's a pretty relevant topic for many of our clients that we have, as well as potentially some others that may be interested in the value of an MES system to support their production operations. So let me go to the next slide. So for the agenda today, I wanted to kind of just do a brief overview of the science behind the cell and gene therapy, look at the manufacturing process, because there are some unique perspectives there that I like to highlight. I'd like to also just cover the basics of what an MES is and the role that it plays in organizations, look at the benefits, how does it fit into an information system architecture in typical organizations, look at some future opportunities to improve the manufacturing process with MES, and some other considerations, and summarize, and we'll go to the Q&A. So as some of you know very well, the area of interest here is under the umbrella of regenerative medicine. Regenerative medicine has been around with us for a few decades now, actually. But the basic concept is using body cells to replace, regenerate, or rejuvenate tissues, organs, and other bodily elements. The terminology in the EU has typically been ATMB, Advanced Therapy Medical Products. It includes gene therapy, somatic cell therapy, tissue engineering products, as well as combinations thereof. So we're going to focus a little bit more on the cell and gene therapy today, but I think there's value in looking at MES even for tissue engineered products. Cell therapy products typically are viable cells that are either injected or grafted or implanted into a patient. There's two basic categories that have kind of evolved so far. And I guess most of the Approved products are allogeneic, meaning that they're patient-specific, meaning that cells are extracted from the specific patient, modified, grown in an ex vivo approach, and then brought back into the patient. The other approach is allogeneic, which is more of a one-to-many, where a donor has been established or a set of donors have been established. Product is then manufactured and able to be placed on a shelf, so to speak, in typically cryopreserved conditions, and then able to be administered to multiple patients. Typical cells that we have seen moving through clinical and commercial have been T cells, including CAR T, natural killer cells. There's a number of others. On the gene therapy side, this is typically a little similar in the sense that you take cells and modify them genetically for patients. A couple of different methods of transfection or transduction is used. But with the viral vector approach, you have a couple of different techniques that are being used in clinical manufacturing currently. The tissue engineered products are much more complex in the sense that you're taking a number of cells and placing them into some type of system by which you're administering to a patient. Some folks may be familiar with some of the skin cell products that have been out there for a while, but there are many other applications that people are working on, including pancreas, liver, heart tissue patches, etc. So here are some examples. Some of them are obviously products on the market today, and I'm not going to get into a lot of detail right now, but there are thousands of clinical studies being done worldwide, and the expectation is that we will be seeing a large number of products being commercialized over the next few years. So this is a very big growing area, and I'm pretty excited about it because I think, we're fundamentally solving some of the more fundamental problems of disease management, and so that's it. When you look at the manufacturing process of these products, the main thing that I wanted to bring out was that the patient, the hospital operations are part of the manufacturing supply chain process. You're taking cells from a patient, packing them so they can be shipped to a particular manufacturing site, modified, and then put back into a condition to be sent back to the patient and administered at a treatment center. And whether you're allogenic or allogeneic, there is a lot of similarity here. So just from the standpoint of the supply chain and manufacturing, timing is of the essence typically. You're dealing with a variability on when the blood cells or whatever tissue that you're using is gotten from the patient. You have to remember the patient is ill, so there's a lot of scheduling issues there that have to be dealt with. But the key to a manufacturing perspective is that you want to modify and get your cells ready back to your patient as soon as possible. Some of the metrics that we've seen in the industry, 20, 21 days, have been answered about. Obviously, improvements to that are possible, but that's kind of where we see a lot of our customers' cycle time. Getting a little bit more specific about what makes cell and gene therapy manufacturing different. The first thing is that there's a large variability with the starting material. The cells from each person are different, and that generates variability that the manufacturing process has to absorb and be able to hopefully accommodate. So there is a number of issues there, as well as the raw materials. Some of the raw materials will also have some variability that needs to be supported. So we're talking about a process that we're trying to reduce the variability. Another aspect is that as opposed to traditional pharmaceutical products, there's a lot of manual activities that are happening in the manufacturing process, typically with smaller equipment, bench scale, that's that comes out of the laboratory. You are conducting a number of unit operations where you're separating out cells, modifying the cells genetically, and then growing them in a bioreactor or T flasks, and then harvesting them. But it does happen in a very small footprint of equipment that needs to be set up in a clean room from a GMP perspective, and so that will be very important to us when we talk about MES. We obviously have cryopreserved activities in our process. The equipment itself has specific unit operations. There has been a direction where the equipment vendors are trying to get more unit operations to be combined in one single piece of equipment, but a lot of this has to do with product-specific requirements, such as the cell characteristics. So during development, certain equipment has been selected and optimized to do that particular unit operation. Therefore, there's a number of transfers between different equipment steps, some of them manual, some of them more automated, and therefore that needs to be factored into the MES. The equipment requires product contacting disposable components like tubing and bags and what have you. And again, those are some steps that are done manually and need to be verified that they have been done correctly. In addition to that, the typical batch records that come out of a cell and gene therapy operation is voluminous. It could be anywhere from a few hundred to 1,000 to 2,000 pages, and part of that is due to the complexity of the unit operations and activities that are done. In addition to that, you have several analytical equipment like cell counters or flow cytometry that need to be also factored in because samples are taken from the equipment or the components in the process and have to be placed into the laboratory instrumentation for analysis and results. Another perspective is that we're dealing with very small quantities here that have to be manipulated and put into small containers like vials or bags, disposable units. So, in the world of pharmaceuticals, whether you're making solid dosage tablets or sterile products, you're usually dealing with, millions of units. In this manufacturing space, we're dealing with a unit of one. And so criticality and the ability to not make errors while doing these manipulations is extremely important. Sometimes you don't have a second chance. Another perspective is that much of the processes today are open processes, meaning that you're manipulating potentially cells under a BSC or biological safety cabinet, as you can see in the picture, or you're transferring materials between units. But as has been presented in other presentations over the last few months, a lot of people are doing great work in closing their process so that contamination and other concerns that we have are being minimized. Another perspective that I want to bring up is that, where is the cell and gene therapy manufacturing being done, right? Folks have heard about Novartis's Chimera being done in a big pharma. There's other organizations coming from a traditional pharma who are building cell and gene therapy operations. But they're really actually a fairly small percentage of the manufacturing operations that exist. Many of them are contract development manufacturing organizations, CMOs, who focus on cell therapy, for example. And they support a lot of smaller clinical organizations that don't necessarily have the manufacturing infrastructure to support their products. So that's beginning to become a very large base of folks that are building facilities. The third category, which I find extremely interesting, and it is an area to be discussed even with MES, is that future locations of this type of processing may actually be in what we call near-patient manufacturing. And what I'm talking about is manufacturing product in medical research centers like Dana-Farber or Memorial Sloan Kettering, or other hospitals that focus in a particular area like oncology or cancer drugs. So what we're seeing here is a distributed model of manufacturing. And what is that really going to mean for us, right? We need to be able to able to support that. And one of the things that becomes very important there is that the information that's generated at these various locations needs to be managed. We still need to have GMPs, and we still need to make the product correctly. We still have the need for quality and manufacturing and supply chain folks to be involved. So having a distributed operation where you could have one or multiple products being made, at these different centers, needs to be contended with from an MAS perspective. So I'll just start out with the most basic thing. What is an MES, right? It's typically a computer system that's been used to track and control transformation of raw materials into finished product. MES, the manufacturing execution systems, have been with us probably for, I don't know, maybe 50 to 60 years in different industries. However, in the pharmaceutical industry, it's been around probably a little less, but still significant, as well as the beginning of cell and gene therapy space. In these applications, we're mostly focused on electronic batch record, and we'll get into that a little bit more. But it also has additional functionality that's not necessarily reflected in a piece of paper, right, in a paper batch record. One, that you're controlling the workflow. You're actually telling the operator and the equipment what steps will be allowed and not allowed. You have a degree of resource verification. Is the equipment, is the facility the right place where you're supposed to make the product? Do you have the proper utilities, the proper material to make the product? Is the equipment in calibration status that's acceptable? So the system has the ability for verifying a number of things, including personnel. If an individual operator has not been trained in this particular step that's required in the batch record, it won't allow them to execute. It also provides relevant information and documents that need to be shown or visible in the manufacturing operation. So bringing all the information necessary, things like MSDSs or SOPs or other pieces of information that are critical to be able to execute the process, are all kind of brought into the MES and made visible to the individual. Material tracking control, we'll get into this with, the chain of custody and chain of identity in manufacturing. But MES has been doing this for a long time, and it's one of the basic functions. It's to understand, do we have the right raw material? Are we processing it correctly? Do we have the right work in progress? And are we making the finished product correctly according to the procedures? The other thing that will become more and more important as we move forward with cell and gene therapy is collecting data associated with the unit operations and activities for analysis. The ability to see multi-batch information. How is the batches trending, so to speak, right? Are we very consistent in the batches that are being made, or there's a lot of variability? So MES really can be doing quite a bit of things. And on the right-hand side here, you see a slide that I borrowed from MESA, which is an association for MES. And they talk about many functionalities that would be pertained to an MES. And I will tell you that some of these functions are also represented in separate systems other than MES, but I just wanted to give you a flavor of what an MES functionality could include. And it would depend on the vendor that you're speaking to in terms of their focus and forte. This slide here basically is the traditional levels that we represent in an architecture. Starting from the bottom, you can see that the level 0, the physical production process itself, and then we layer onto that sensors and process control systems, PLCs, or some type of control unit that controls the unit operations and the flow of the material. Level 3 is really where the MES comes into play, where you develop a workflow and a recipe management system to actually control the process overall and to document the activities that are conducted. The other aspect is that, and people need to just keep this in mind, that not all the information that's used in MES is within MES system. It comes from other systems like ERP, limbs, etc. So that fourth level is really relevant because that ties the manufacturing operation into the business logic, right, and planning. So MES doesn't stand by itself, but is a part of the overall landscape, if you will. Some of the roles of an MES. I think one of the first things that I think, in some of our consultants, clients that we speak to, do consulting engagements, is that they need to understand that the master batch record in an MES is not equivalent to the paper batch record that people are using currently. The master batch record in an MES is so much more powerful. It has the ability for replication, for templatizing the information, and then applying resources to it so that you can control batches beyond one instance. It can give you multiple batches from that single batch record. And as you can see in the diagram there, one master batch record for one product could be, if you will, electronically copied into multiple electronic batch records that could be not just at one facility, but across multiple facilities. And then when you populate that batch record, you've got your complete batch record that documents what occurred. In addition to that, in this era of quality by design, the critical quality attributes and the critical process parameters are also important to be supported in the batch record. So much of those measurements, whether they be done at the level 1, as I indicated in the previous slide, or at, within the laboratory, those pieces of information are relevant to be placed into the batch record. Another key function is that we dispatch and execute production orders to the floor. And in the case of cell and gene therapy, patient priority is extremely important. As I said earlier, with the supply chain, there's a time-critical nature of when that material needs to be brought back to the patient. So prioritization and knowing which product needs to be made for which patient is extremely important, and that alignment to the supply chain logistics. You also ensure procedural controls for sequence of activities, as well as material and equipment verification, as I alluded to earlier. You issue the batch record to the floor, as opposed to sending paper to the floor. So one of the main, we'll talk about benefits in a little bit, but in essence, we're kind of eliminating that whole concept of copying paper, on a copy machine and bundling it together and sending it into a clean room. You're basically issuing it electronically, and when the operator looks at their screen, they have a number of batches they need to produce, and they have a sequence there in which to follow. Workflow managed by a set of activities, verifying resources to the batch, including equipment, resource, material, personnel. We track material, whether it be raw materials, WIP, and finished product on the factory floor. So a lot of folks will say, well, isn't my ERP system doing that? Well, yeah, it is, but at a higher level, less granular, and typically done, on the incoming side of manufacturing and the outgoing. But the granularity of the factory floor requirements to support the chain of custody and identity during manufacturing is important, so that this particular bag of blood cells are going back to this specific patient, for example. Another big feature is the GMP requirements. We can provide a more efficient way of maintaining the GMPs with things like material reconciliation with mass balances, controls, and documentation required. And finally, you're producing an electronic batch record at the end of the batch, which then can be referenced and reviewed by various folks in the organization. So what are the benefits of MES? This is let's be honest, right? This is a large investment of time and money. You're going to be doing some changes to the processes, changes to documentation. You're training people to do things differently. What's the value? Well, first thing is that you can leverage your batch record across the product life cycle. So especially with the cell and gene therapy activities that are going on currently in clinical, people tend to want to wait until they get a commercial product before they introduce MES. Well, we've been involved in a couple of projects on that, and what's happened is that people who have created the batch records for clinical, see a major change in the batch records for commercial then. So there's an impedance that has to be reckoned with. So having it done earlier in the life cycle allows you to migrate easier into a commercial operation. And also, when you think about it from a validation standpoint and all the activities you have to do for training, validation, and what have you, the batch record approach can allow you to replicate the master batch record to those various needs. Another major benefit of an MES is right first time. You're reducing the errors with calculations, signatures, correct materials and equipment, personnel being trained. So, there's a lot of experience, I guess, experiential history that we have with, pharmaceutical firms who have paper batch records and all the errors that get created, missing signatures, someone didn't calculate it properly, what have you. With an MES system, you're basically eliminating the errors and getting closer to right first time from a lean standpoint. You can also reduce the batch record cycle time by real-time review. So instead of waiting till the batch record is completed before you have QA and other folks reviewing your batch record, you could be doing it online in parallel to manufacturing. The closed loop process there, I think, is very important because now the QA people, manufacturing, and say your tech group or MSAT group could all be working collaboratively as you're making the batch. You're reducing variability because things are more consistent. You're driving a higher success rate of the batches, which is critical for cell and gene because you really only have potentially one shot at making that batch. Ensuring a complete batch record documentation is complete. So when you finish the batch in MES, it's checking to make sure that all the appropriate information is being associated with that batch record along the way. And we'll talk a little bit more later about equipment information and the differences there with cell and gene therapy. Managing the chain of identity and custody, I think we mentioned that a few times. Big deal. Remove the paper from the clean rooms. Sounds like it's not an issue. It's a very big issue for a lot of folks. People are putting in autoclaves to sterilize paper. You really want to get away from that, right? I mean, it's a major stumbling block when you're talking about thousands of papers moving in and out of the clean rooms. The potential for contamination is there, and creating processes to support paper is probably not the thing you really want to do. Increased data integrity, obviously, with checking and balancing along the process steps, you're increasing the accuracy and the validity of the data. And finally, reducing your COGS, cost of goods, by exception-based review. Now, I'm not saying that that's something that you're going to lean into at the beginning of an MES project, but the ultimate goal is that you really want the system to check and balance and only review exceptions, from a QA standpoint. But you do need to have a significant history to support that. But I think that's a major plus in terms of, implementing an MES and what the long-term benefit could be. So how does an MES fit into an information system architecture, right? We're talking about bringing in a new piece of software, in some cases, very expensive software, and you need to figure out how that's going to relate to everything else you got going on, right? So because it's more of an OT, operational technology, it ties very well to the PLCs and the control systems on the floor. But as I said earlier, MES is asked to also communicate to ERP and your other systems within your organization. We need to make sure that sourcing the information from the proper system is accounted for. You don't want to have the same information in multiple systems. All that does is create transcription, potential transcription errors and wasted time. So MES is really a system by which you want to leverage these other systems like ERP, your asset management systems, etc. The other thing that I'd like to just share with you is that this whole concept of converging OT and IT into the information system architecture, I think, is extremely important. Some of you folks may have heard about this convergence, but what it's really about is how do we leverage the technology of, IT, right, the traditional information part of the organization with the operational side. I'll give you one example that I think is extremely relevant, right, is networking, right? When I started doing this type of work many, many years ago, Ethernet and networks were non-existent on the factory floor. We started putting them in and connecting them into the corporate backbone. We had to do that with certain technology to isolate and make sure that we had information integrity, but not creating problems on the corporate network. But using Ethernet technology nowadays is almost a no-brainer. Everybody knows that they have that, and we have wireless, right? So that's an example where PLCs and all these other systems that we have on the factory floor, and especially with cell and gene therapy equipment, should be able to connect into that network so that information connectivity can be had, if you will. You've probably heard about the industry Internet of Things and edge computing. Well, that's all about making things connectable, right? Whether it's that bag of blood coming in from your apheresis center to the point where you're sending it back to a treatment center, and everything in between is being tracked. So the blood itself has some type of RFID tag or what have you that actually allows you to track it through its supply chain. We have to enable the patient and hospital information systems also. In this ecosystem of regenerative medicine, we need to share information. And, we need to make sure that we account for when the blood was, say, for example, extracted from the person's body on this particular date and time, because that may actually need to be incorporated into the manufacturing start time. Or there may be some measurements of the blood that would be important when you start your process in manufacturing. So again, sharing information across the supply chain would be something that you want the MES to take advantage of. And finally, the integration of corporate information systems. We can't forget about this. And many clinical operations don't have necessarily all these systems, as we have learned. And it's something that we have to overcome, either by building smaller systems that still support the operations or tying into a general ERP system, if you will. But we've got to make sure that the architecture supports the master data being put into the right source system and then being utilized by the MES. So what are some of the future opportunities for improving the manufacturing process with MES? I think sometimes people don't think about that, but once you have an MES, you can do a number of other things. You can evaluate your current manufacturing process and see how you can lean it out. Looking at the activities and possibly automate activities to reduce the cycle time, improve the quality, and then integrate that into MES for documentation purposes. You can consider new technologies like the Internet of Things, as I said earlier, specifically with process analytical technology with measurements on the cells, using barcode and RFID technology for tracking, and biometrics for personnel verification. In you could look at the process equipment control systems and look at how we can download recipes to them from the MES, as well as upload process data from them into the batch records. Some of our clients are not there yet with their equipment vendors, but I would urge the equipment vendors to support that as opposed to an isolated data set. Many of them have printouts, but that's really not what you want, right? A printout in the clean room, you'd have to take it out, scan it, copy it, and put it into the electronically as a PDF. Wouldn't it be much easier to have that already electronically communicated over the internet into your MES system? Additional automation and communication capability. A lot of the laboratory testing equipment can be integrated with MES, and again, reduce this whole concept of manual transcription errors. Another aspect is data aggregation for manufacturing analytics. Manufacturing analytics provides us the ability to look at multivariate parameters on the process to support quality by design, but also annual product reviews. So the ability to have your data in a centralized repository that can be then drilled into it with various analytical tools would be important. You can generate SPC charts, understand the variability of the process parameters, and again, improve it. Integrating into supply chain for digitalization, sharing the data across the supply chain, as I mentioned earlier, I think that would be a very important need for cell and gene therapy. Evaluating the impact of transitioning from manual processes to automated closed systems with verification. As you automate your process on the factory floor, it can be a valuable effort towards verifying that things were done correctly every time, and therefore your batch record can be simplified. Integrating business planning and quality into MES, I think that we've already talked about that, and again, that the aggregation of data. So a few other points I want to bring up. We find that many of our clients have the greatest intentions and they want to see these MES systems up and running immediately, but I think there's some other non-technical perspective to share. One is that you need management support for the change that you need in your business processes and organizational changes. You're going to see the need for new roles in the organization that maybe these smaller organizations haven't thought about. You know, the concept of recipe authors, that can translate the process into a set of steps in the master batch record. You may want to improve your processes that surround the manufacturing operation. Maybe you're going to look at a different way of moving material from your warehouse into your manufacturing operation. You may look at testing to be done more online versus in the laboratory. You're also going to need to think about implementation. Trying to bite the elephant in all one step is going to be somewhat difficult. So we highly recommend a multi-phased approach, and we've shared this with many of our clients that it's better to scope out smaller steps that are more manageable for the change that you need to do in the plant. We've also noticed with cell and gene therapy, flexibility for clinical batches is needed. There seems to be a number of changes that are done in the process while executing. So a clinical batch in cell and gene therapy seems to have some need for a lot of flexibility in modifying the steps. You may actually take a measurement in the process and have to repeat your step again. For example, cell separation in a centrifuge. You may have to do that 2 or 3 times based on some type of measured parameter. The deployment in near-patient manufacturing, I think that's a really important aspect. We haven't really understood what that's going to totally mean, but having small manufacturing isolation units in hospitals, I think that's part of the future for cell and gene therapy, and how are we going to deal with that? MES expertise. This is really important. We found that, part of our role as consultants is to train and guide people with the important aspects of trying to do an MES implementation. The folks that are, the brilliant PhD folks that are helping develop these cells, they really don't have an understanding of, some of the technical details of MES. So it's good for us to help them understand what needs to be done first, second, and so on. And finally, long-term support. And this is a pitch not for us, not for the consultants. It's mostly for the internal operations of the owners. They need to have an understanding of what MES is and how they're going to manage it and run their operations with it. So in summary, you need to plan for manufacturing and MES early in the product development stages for cell and gene therapy. We think that's an important thing to do. Design master batch records for MES, not paper-based. This requires early involvement with the product development folks. You don't want to create a paper batch record and have to convert it later on. It tends to disrupt the operations. MES must be aligned with the other information systems and factory floor equipment automation. Align master data management and source systems and the architecture. Ensure a valid user requirement specification that documents the requirements of your cell and gene therapy operation and have a project plan with MES SMEs. And never forget this one point, and I think it's, anyone who has done an MES project realizes this, that MES is not about the technology. It's really about business processes and people. Getting that alignment with the organization of the changes that you need to make to operate in MES is very important. We've gotten to a point with many of the vendors able to deliver the functional requirements of the technology. I think that is less of an issue today than it was, say, 30 years ago. We have great technology out there, but we still need to support changes to the business processes and people and having the organization move forward in that transition. And I think that's it.
Great. Terrific, Bob. Thank you very much. You certainly covered a tremendous amount of information, and you really did break it down very effectively. So we do have a number of questions here. Let me get to, we'll get to a few of them. Our friend David out there has a few more than a few, but we'll certainly get to one of his.
All right.
First question up is, how important is it to re-engineer the paper batch record for MES?
Yeah, this is a really important topic. This is like one of the first things we get into, because the current paper batch records don't take advantage of the functionality that the MES has. It presumes that each step is done by a person and there's no interaction with the database or other elements of an MES. So we need to re-engineer the batch record so that it becomes more simplified and the individual tasks are delineated in the MES with verification steps. So it's really a change in how you look at the MES batch record. I hope I answered that.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yep, it sounds right. And just a housekeeping note, while Bob is answering the questions here, it's really important for all of us to have your feedback. So if you could fill out that feedback form that appears on the bottom of your screen while Bob is answering the questions, that'll be terrific. So Bob, as an estimate, what proportion of major manufacturers have implemented MES?
Okay, so it depends on the industry. The automotive industry, the airline industry, even the food industry has done a significant amount of implementation with MES. And when you think about, a plane with 100,000 components all needing to be aligned, right? The MES functionality makes that happen a lot more effectively, right? In terms of the pharmaceutical industry, the large biotech and the large firms, the Pfizers, the Mercks, AstraZenecas, they have made some major investments in MES. With regards to cell and gene therapy, as I said, a much smaller percentage, but the firms that have done it have been the big pharma. So what I think we're on the cusp here, and I hope, people can appreciate that. We do hope that many of the smaller firms come to the realization that an MES is important for them. Not maybe necessarily immediately, but certainly as clinical batches increase in number of batches increases, the MES becomes more efficient to be able to make more batches. So I think it's going to increase substantially in this space over the next few years.
Yep, makes sense. You did mention leveraging the master batch record. Can you provide some additional examples of that?
Yeah, so the master batch record in a MES is different than the paper batch record that people are familiar with. The master batch record in a MES is really a framework. It's a template that gets populated with steps that need to be executed in a particular sequence or in parallel. It also references material, equipment, people, facility elements that need to be used to execute. And what it does, it provides that framework in which to invoke those functions out of the MES system. Paper doesn't do that, right? So a master batch record really is more of a template that gets built out to execute on the factory floor. And I
Gotcha.
should say one more thing, that the master batch record in the MES system still needs to be signed off. It still has to be reviewed and approved. Those functions are all still required, but it's done in a, let me just say this, instead of one piece of paper or several pieces of paper, you're dealing with a lot of individual records that are assembled in this framework. So it's really not a piece of paper, although you could print it out maybe in a PDF format, but it's really all about a workflow engine coupled with a manufacturing batch record template that gets executed. So it's really a framework, if you will.
Gotcha. Switching gears here to really more of the impression of MES. There are a lot of organizations that do look at MES as an IT project. Do you have a response, or how would you tackle that as far as advice to these folks considered that way?
Absolutely. So remember, if I go back to my slide, can I go back to my slide? I think I can, right? Where I pointed out the MES project is 80% business process and people. Well, that clearly points it back into the business area. The business area needs to take ownership. This is a project that has a technology component to it, but needs to really be based in the business. Typically, we see the successful projects having a project manager out of the business who really can align all the resources internally and go through the change management process, both on the process, the business processes and the manufacturing process, as well as what changes you need to do in terms of people, training, the culture change, understanding different aspects of MES. So this is definitely not an IT project per se. However, there are IT components to it, and please, no disrespect to the IT folks. I used to be one, and I understand there's a need to do, there's importance to that role. But in MES, because of the factory floor, because of manufacturing, because this is more operational technology dealing with equipment, control systems, what have you, it's more of a business. But it points to the, the convergence of OT and IT that I mentioned earlier.
Mm-hmm.
I hope I answered.
Can you? Yep, I think that's pretty good. Certainly, releasing a batch with MES has a time reduction element to it. Can you compare that to using MES versus paper?
Yeah. So a couple of assumptions, or if you have, the first thing I wanted to say was that not all the information for the batch release is going to be in MES, right? You're going to have data in your deviation system, investigations, your LIMS system, for example. So your quality management system and LIMS are going to have information. But with regards to the batch record review itself, you could see a substantial reduction. I mean, I've seen, 50 to 70% reductions in time to do a batch record review. But that's also assuming, you've gotten, people, really acclimated using the MES the way it should be done. But you can see a significant reduction.
So the next question, as far as the, I'll just read here. How important is release by exception for the cell and gene therapy industry, which typically has batch records, in the hundreds of pages?
Yeah. So again, to me, release by exception just helps reduce the cycle time of getting the batch released, right? So think about it, right? If the product takes, say, 20 days to manufacture, right, but it's going to take you another 90 days to release the batch for all the reviews and everything you're doing, the total cycle time isn't 20 days, right? It's the 20 days plus the overall cycle review. So review by exception could have a major impact if you, look at the total cycle time. If you're going to release product conditionally or on quarantine back to the infusion center, there's risks associated with that. You really want to have a product released before you send it out of your facility. But even if you can send it to the patient infusion center, you still want the batch released within a relative short period of time. And when you think about, sterility, pyrogen testing, other testing that may take a long period of time, plus the review, it's much, much longer than the actual manufacturing cycle time.
Great.
So I think you can have a real big impact.
Yeah. Okay. You touched on the fact that companies will need flexibility when it comes to MES solutions. Can you expand upon that as far as how that applies to cell and gene therapy, having flexibility within their MES solutions?
Yeah. So I'll use the example a little bit more than I had chatted earlier. Let's say, for example, one of the process steps that happens in a cell and gene therapy, you may do multiple incubations, right? So you may incubate the first time, take a process measurement, say cell count, and based upon that cell count, you may go back and incubate another time, and so on and so forth. It may happen 3 or 4 or 5 passages may have to occur before you can have the proper cell quantity to move on into the next step of the process. So the batch record has to have the flexibility to be able to allow the operator to repeat that step multiple times. But when you create the batch record for the floor, you may not know how many times that is. So you need to have the flexibility for the operator or the management team to be able to make a decision on repeating certain steps in the batch record. So that's one of the examples of flexibility.
Gotcha. Great. Well, you know what? I think Bob will call it a presentation right now. We got to most of the questions. There still are a few out there, which if we didn't get to your question, folks, Bob will respond to you directly. David, that's for you for sure, because David has a number of questions. So, but
okay.
In general, I'd like to thank you, Bob, and certainly our audience for participating. Great Q&A that's there. This recording will be available up on the Xconomy website in its entirety. So I know there was a question about the slides being available. The answer is yes. You'll be able to see the presentation on demand starting tomorrow. Bob will get back to you if we haven't answered your question. And so on behalf of Xconomy and Global OT/IT Quality Services, thank you very much for joining us today. Have a productive remainder of the day. Take care and stay safe. Thanks, everybody. Thanks,
Bye-bye now.